Hey everyone, this is Max Schneider. This is our final presentation for environmental biotechnology, and mine will be about microplastics, what they do to your brain, and what the world can do about it through the lens of environmental biotechnology. So in this presentation, I'll give you guys an introduction on microplastics, some definitions, some sources, then I'll go into why we should be caring about microplastics. There's several reasons. What exactly they do to our brains, what can be done from the standpoint of using biotechnology, and then some basic conclusions we can draw from this presentation. So as an introduction to microplastics, the biggest thing you should know is that plastic manufacturing has exploded in the last 50 years. It is difficult to overstate how popular plastic has become as a material. And this graph here gives you a pretty good idea. If back in 1950 we had less than 10 million tons of plastic being produced each year, maybe 1 million, we're up far beyond 400 million tons of global plastic production. And that's it's difficult to quantify. That's lots and lots and lots of plastic. It's a versatile material, so that's kind of what is attributed to its rise in popularity. It can be used in almost anything, containers, automobiles, airplanes, lab equipment, you name it. But only about 9% of this plastic waste is being recycled. That teal bar on the right side of this graph represents proportions of plastic being recycled in different parts of the world. The purple bar is incineration. That's slightly better. You're at least not putting the plastic in the ocean, but it's still assuming it is incinerated in an environmentally responsible way. You're emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, and the fly ash that comes from incineration can be toxic as well. Landfilling and then mismanaging or just littering is the vast majority of plastic fates, which is a real bummer. And that kind of explains why so much of it is ending up in our marine environments and terrestrial environments. So lots of it's being produced, but a lot of that production, most of it, the vast majority of it, is just getting stuck in the environment. So plastic degrades really, really slowly. It can take up to thousands, tens of thousands of years for plastic to degrade into carbon dioxide and water. Since plastic is a polymer chain of mostly hydrocarbons, those are the main byproducts of its degradation. There's a lot of mechanical or physical processes that happen that encourage the fragmentation of plastic, such as just regular erosion. There's something called wave action, which is the force from waves crashing against one another and pressing these pieces of plastic, just crashing them into each other. And just like the churning action of the oceans causes wear and erosion. Exposure to the sun provides thermal input that enables the infiltration of oxygen to kind of break those long polymer chains in the plastic apart so that it can fragment into smaller plastics. And then microbes kind of make up the end of that degradation process where they form biofilm on the outside of the plastic and start to degrade the hydrocarbon chains inside of it. And so all of this fragmentation means that plastic inevitably makes its way towards microplastic, which is any plastic compound between 0.1 micrometers and 5 millimeters in diameter. So why should we care about that? Okay, so plastic is in our environment. What does it mean? Well, plastic is not just in our environment. Plastic is in every environment. Plastic is in every organism, every place. Everything you thought you might not have to worry about it is false. You are exposed to microplastics everywhere. And measuring microplastics properly is pretty difficult. Microplastics eventually break down into what are called nanoplastics, which are smaller than that size frame I gave you before, less than 0.1 micrometers or less than 100 nanometers. But with the estimation methods we do have, in the oceans we've estimated 171 trillion particles of microplastic. Like I said, those don't include nanoplastics, less than 100 millimeters. Those are a bit too difficult to count. They usually make their way through the sieves or grates or screens that can be used for capturing plastics. However, nanoplastics are some of the most alarming plastics, as they've been shown to easily infiltrate biological systems and organisms. Microplastics are in the air we breathe. A study done in the UK showed that homes have so many synthetic fibers in clothing, carpeting, building materials, tools, packaging, anything, you name it. And that makes its way into the air inside of homes, so that humans are breathing something on the order of 2,000 to 4,000 microplastic particles per day. Plants and animals have it as well in high concentrations from all kinds of uptake sources. The graphics on the right will show you some of the broad paths that plastics take in our lives. Humans can directly emit them themselves, or they can come from our industrial processes. Either way, they make their way to microplastics and nanoplastics and then get taken up in the food chain. That's more what the lower graphic is about, is how those microplastics in the environment get pulled up into plants, and those plants get eaten by animals that we eat, and it just magnifies its way up the food chain. Babies have been shown to be born with significant levels of microplastics, something incredibly alarming. That means that microplastics from the mother are being passed to children, and they're given sort of a baseline level. There is no human without microplastic contamination at this point, is what that means, and we kind of can't get rid of it. So we better learn more about it. And then in us, adult humans, there are models that predict lifetime accumulations of over 50,000 particles, which would be about 40.7 nanograms of plastic inside of your body. And that's just the median amount. In that study, they were only analyzing adults in New York City, searching for polyethylene terephthalate, which is PET, and polycarbonate, PC. All samples that they tested contained some plastic. There was no single person that tested negative for plastic across the board. So microplastics are in us, and they're all around us. And we should care about it because they harm the environment. This graphic on the right is a great overview. Not all of it is perfectly applicable to microplastics, but those boxed areas definitely are. They can serve as a pathogenic vector, meaning that bacteria or disease can sometimes latch onto it as it migrates and then be deposited somewhere where it has a more successful environment. And it actually, one of the ones I missed at the top, it can also be a raft for non-indigenous species. Very small species can be carried on microplastics and then start to disrupt ecosystems, which is what the lower 2 points are about: effects on the benthic environment and ecosystem disruption by microplastics. So what exactly do these microplastics do? Yes, they are everywhere. Yes, they are broadly harming ecosystems, but specifically their impacts on flora and fauna, including us humans, are physical damage and obstruction. That's a big one. Plastic can adhere to the roots of plants and adhere to certain surfaces of animals and kind of be a lightweight abrasive. When it's ingested, it can damage interior tissues of animals really easily. On top of that, when animals interact with plastic, they're usually not sure how to do so, and so things like the duck on the right can happen. That whale isn't a real whale, that's actually an art piece. by an artist in South America. I thought it was a really awesome piece of art, though, because it looks a lot like a whale, and it's full of plastic. It's very indicative of how much plastic. The artist made that from purely recovered plastics on the beaches of South America. I can't remember exactly which country. I think Colombia. Microplastics can also obstruct and damage the roots of plants and prevent nutrient uptake. When it's inside the organ functions, the organ systems of animals, it can interrupt organ function, and those two things impede growth and reproduction. It has negative impacts on hormone levels in animals, which are usually involved in reproduction, and it stunts growth of plants and cell groups in animals. It can interrupt metabolism. Studies have shown that it'll reduce metabolic rates of animals. And then it can also introduce oxidative stress to any and all organisms it comes into contact with. And oxidative stress is something that is induced by interaction with compounds that are made from oxygen. There are things called reactive oxygen species, known as ROS, and they're reactive compounds formed from diatomic oxygen. And those compounds readily react with all kinds of other substances, materials, compounds, and usually end up degrading them. So oxidative stress is more or less degradation from those reactive oxygen species. And oxidative stress is something that you encounter no matter what as an organism in the world, but microplastics reduce an organism's ability to handle or cope with oxidative stress. That's bad. We'll get into that later. And just like climate change, microplastic is an accumulation of a substance beyond natural amounts. Okay, climate change is about carbon dioxide, which is a naturally occurring molecule, and the accumulation of that en masse is causing bad things to happen. Microplastics are not even an organic, naturally occurring substance. It's fully xenobiotic, and accumulation of any compound on this scale has already shown to cause changes to Earth's systems, usually in ways that are bad for us. At least, systems are going to be obstructed on microscopic levels due to the really high concentrations of plastic material, and inevitably these changes caused by accumulating plastic are going to be bad for us. And microplastics finally have been shown to be neurotoxic. Neurotoxic just means something that's toxic to your brain. One study has shown that microplastics definitively cross the blood-brain barrier in humans and mice. The blood-brain barrier is like a filtration mechanism in the capillaries of your brain and spinal tissues that can block certain substances, and it's a way of protecting really vulnerable tissues in your brain and your spinal cord from interactions with molecules that would be harmful. And that shows that plastics, regardless of their impact, have the ability to get into your tissues that are sensitive, your brain. Like I said earlier, oxidative stress is neurotoxic, and microplastics reduce our ability to cope with that, which means that recovery from that oxidative stress, that degradation, doesn't happen as much. And then there's other additional effects that are pretty difficult to quantify. But that's why we're going to get more into what microplastics do to our brains. A little bit of background to help you understand the next slide. Your brain, as many of you know, is made up of many different regions, like your prefrontal cortex, and there's like left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and each of those have different structures inside of each one, and each of them does different things, but each region is typically involved in a wide variety of activity, some in all activity. And all of those regions are connected by many little information highways known as neurons. Neurons enable communication by using what are known as neurotransmitters. The graphic on the right is a blown up figure of a neuron. That sort of round bone to socket interaction is what happens at a neuron when it communicates. It uses neuron transmitters, which are like ion channels inside of the cell, to convey an electrical charge. Because these ions are charged either positively or negatively, and they release from one end to another, it's like propagating an electrical signal. And that happens in the blink of an eye, faster than a blink of an eye, in milliseconds, very, very short time scale. And these neurons also transmit signals not just between regions of your brain, but from your brain to other faculties of your body. So they enable motor function, they keep your heart beating, they keep tissues functioning properly. It is for coordination of living, essentially, is what neurotransmitters are used for. So they're really important. And those changes that I mentioned earlier pretty much just mean faster rates of degradation of tissue, cognitive decline, and behavioral change. So oxidative stress is a very, very broad field. That's one thing that needs to be better quantified and more specifically studied, so we know which tissues in the brain are being degraded. But broadly speaking, there are increased rates of tissue degradation and cognitive decline. One of the more difficult to quantify effects that I mentioned earlier is the inhibition of what is called acetylcholinesterase. That's an enzyme of a particular neurotransmitter used in your brain and your body called acetylcholine. And in discussions with a neuroscientist, my wife Alex, that oxidative stress, an expanded or increased level of degradation, means you're at higher risk of neurodegenerative diseases. The graphic on the left shows what happens when you have a neurodegenerative disease. The brain on the left is healthy, and the one on the right is that of an advanced Alzheimer's patient. Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, and essentially you lose function of your brain over time. That's what oxidative stress broadly can contribute to. And the accumulation of acetylcholine, that is caused when you inhibit the enzyme that gets rid of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, as a neurotransmitter, kind of has a finite lifespan. All neurotransmitters do. They have generation, then they have like a working lifetime, and then they have disposal by these enzymes, and it's sort of like a natural cycle within your body. Microplastics interrupt that natural cycle and prevent acetylcholinesterase from breaking down acetylcholine, meaning it's going to accumulate. That accumulation can be really bad. It can cause continuous stimulation of your muscles and glands and the central nervous system. As I mentioned, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's not just used in the brain, but also throughout the body. So it's used for motor function. You can have interruption of motor function or halting of motor function. Excuse me, I'm getting word soup. And that can sometimes result in fatal convulsions in the worst cases. So it's not good. But what can be done about this if it's clearly bad for us and the field of its neurotoxicity is developing? Well, there are two actions broadly that are viewed as the strategy towards microplastics. There's remediation, which is essentially removal and degradation of microplastics. That's, to me, what I call a mitigation strategy. You're trying to mitigate the worst effects of the problem, and that's what we should be putting most of our energy into right now. Within environmental remediation, there is separation, and then there's degradation. Separation is the mechanical removal of microplastics from systems in which you don't want them, and then degradation is turning those removed microplastics into other substances, i.e., carbon dioxide and water. That degradation can only be performed by microbes and through microbial means. But there's huge opportunities for improvement in how much microplastic we can capture, in other words, the scale of separation we can perform, and the speed at which we can degrade those microplastics. Naturally, or with most of our current systems, which use natural microbes, although we try and optimize some of the conditions in which degradation happens, it still takes about 50 years to completely degrade these microplastics. And then treatment of microplastic contamination in organisms would be viewed as an adaptation strategy. Once the contamination has occurred, we want to try and fix the problem. And there are no known treatment options. Microplastics are so small, it's like trying to take a particular hormone out of a person's body. We need significantly more research to learn about how to safely either collect or degrade microplastics from within a human body. So right now, all of our eggs are in the basket of remediation. But luckily, there's lots of different biotechnologies that can help us in this arena. In the realm of separation, there are several different plants. One of the most prolific is known as duckweed. That is a successful accumulator of microplastics on the surface of water. The roots readily adsorb microplastics. Adsorption is when something sticks to the surface of another. It's not being absorbed with a B, but instead adsorbed with a D. The adsorption can be pretty robust so that duckweed can readily retain meaningful amounts of microplastics when you pull it back out of the water. It's a aquatic or plant that sits on the surface of the water. Similar to that, there are fungal mycelial networks that grow on the surface of water as well. Those are very porous and low density. And if you're familiar at all with mycelium, it forms a vast mat, essentially, of interconnected little threads that, if placed properly, could grow around large bodies of microplastics and then be used to remove microplastics from water. Additionally, there are what are called nanomaterials, bio-nanomaterials, which can perform separation alongside immediate degradation. Nanomaterials are like superfine, what do you call them? Grates, superfine meshes that can capture microplastics. Often they can get brittle or they're made of plastic themselves and they can break. Adding the component of bio to it means that you produce the nanomaterial in such a manner that it's compatible with retaining either bacteria or certain microbial cultures on the surface of it, and it can enhance its ability to adsorb microplastics and then perform preliminary degradation so that once you get rid of the microplastic from the bio-nanomaterial, it's in a scenario to more readily be degraded by, the heavy-duty microbes that you're sending it to. It kind of optimizes the natural degradation process. And then degradation itself is performed by many, many, many microbial species. It's already used in wastewater treatment in developed countries, and lots of research and effort is going into optimizing and bioengineering those microbial species such that they can degrade plastic at higher rates and in greater quantities. And additionally, there's a lot of biosensing being done in low concentration contexts where they use certain microbial species to detect low concentrations of microplastics in water. So what can we draw from all of this? Well, the situation with microplastics is a little bit bleak. They're bad, we know that. And we're still getting to how bad. We might not know exactly how bad. However, one thing is certain. All studies have shown that the negative impacts of microplastics have greater and more drastic changes with higher concentrations of microplastics. Therefore, reducing microplastic concentrations in environments worldwide is in our best interest. Microplastics are bad because they age your brain prematurely through oxidative stress and other effects, such as interruption of neurotransmitter activity and natural cycles of neurotransmitters in the brain. And they're ubiquitous now. They're everywhere. So exposure elimination is not really feasible. The best approach is to minimize your exposure with best practices. Best practices might sound a little vague, but best practices of avoidance include using non-plastic products when you can, denying single-use plasticware when eating out, and purchasing clothing with natural fibers, as well as spending more time outdoors. That study in the UK was corroborated by authors in the US. I don't think the numbers were exactly the same, but spending time in your home means exposure to microplastics. So getting out in nature is a way to just put yourself in a lower concentration microplastic environment. A lot like nutrition, this is kind of a class discriminatory measure that can be taken, minimizing your exposure to microplastics, which is unfortunate. It's a lot like food or nutrition, like I said. Healthy food is typically more difficult to access and more expensive, and plastic is cheaper and more ubiquitous. So if you don't have the money to afford non-plastic products and lifestyles that minimize plastic avoidance, unfortunately, you are forced to bear the brunt of higher microplastic exposure. Another problem with equity when it comes to microplastic exposure. And finally, we have solutions to this problem of microplastic infiltration, but we need those solutions to get bigger. In other words, we need to scale them larger and capture more microplastic, and we need them to work faster. We need to degrade the microplastic at greater rates in greater quantities. Overall, that's it. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. These are some of my sources, and if you've got any questions, throw them in the comments. Thank you very much.